Hello, welcome to a talk with the authors at the University of St. Andrews Alumni Weekend. I'm Jeff Jarvis from the City University of New York's Graduate School of Journalism, and I am honored beyond expression to be talking today to two of my intellectual heroes and the leaders of book history. First is Andrew Pettegree, who I think of as the dean of book history. And also Arthur de Weduwen, who is the the British British Academy postdoctoral fellow at St. Andrews, where he got his PhD. We're going to be talking today about their book, which is The Library of Fragile History. If you're in the United States, it has a different cover with a different publisher. This is the British edition, which I had imported because I wanted to read it before anyone else. It is a wonderful book about the history. That's what we'll be talking about as we go. First, by means of introduction, as I say, these are the leading scholars in book history today. I started my personal interest in book history when I read some years ago the monumental Elizabeth Eisenstein book, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change. And I was so enthralled that I started picking up everything I could get about book history. And again, I came to Andrew Pettegree's books without fail. A few of them, just since I'm doing show and tell, I might as well show them off. Reformation and the Culture of Persuasion. This was extremely important to me, the book in the Renaissance. As a journalist, The Invention of News is something I recommend to my students. And what's fascinating about what Andrew has done around this is to find the tangents off of book history and how it affects everything else. So we also have Brand Luther, which is a fascinating discussion of both religion and branding. And then Andrew teamed up with Arthur to write The Bookshop of the World, which is a magnificent book about trading books in the Dutch Golden Age. And on top of all that, they edit and write for a Brill series. I spent a fortune to get this one on book history. And as if that is not enough, they also direct, Andrew is the director and Arthur is the co-director, the Universal Short Title Catalogue, which is a hubristic and monumental effort to record the titles of everything that was printed after movable type in 1450-ish with Gutenberg, up through now 1650 with 830,000 editions listed, and soon it will go to 1700, doubling that number. So I want to start there, actually, because I'm fascinated, gentlemen, with the relationship of the short title catalog and the book you've just written. And to me, what emotionally strikes me about the short title catalog is that you are often cataloging that which does not exist anymore. You found a reference to it in another book or in an auction catalog or somewhere. And so you're creating what I think of as the ghost library, the things that don't, many times, not all the time, but many times do not exist, that you probably will never be able to touch and see and read. And that struck me as terribly frustrating. Yet when I read your book about the library as a fragile institution, the ephemerality of everything, the mirage of permanence that we give ourselves in the library really struck me. So I'm curious whether the short title catalog relates to, in any way, the work you did on the new book, The Library, and I'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for those kind words, and thanks for joining us today. You've been a tremendous support to our projects over the years, although we have never met physically, one of the paradoxes of these strange times. Well, yes, the work we've done for our books has enormously informed the Universal Short Title Catalogue, which is an attempt to chronicle and to document all books which were once published, rather than that subsection which are now in libraries, so can be materially catalogued. It's one of the convenient untruths of the book world to think that the books that have survived are an adequate window on the reading preferences of previous years. Whereas, in fact, the books which they most enjoyed, the books most likely to have been in their libraries, will have been used to death. And paradoxically, a lot of the books that survive in libraries today survive precisely because they were not much read. And having been round these libraries, you can pick up a great folio and open it with an enormous crack as its binder is strained for the first time in 200 years. And when we were working on the book that Arthur and I did together, The Bookshop of the World, we found an awful lot of books listed in various resources that we couldn't find a copy of. So it's actually easier than you might imagine to document lost books. And I'll pass over to Arthur and he can explain a little bit of how we do that.
Use of were printed book catalogues. So 17th century catalogues that list books that were due to be sold at auction. So those are absolutely fascinating for the USTC for our project, because exactly, they often contain items that were once published and are no longer in libraries today. And this was one of the key things that informed our work on this latest book, The Library of Fragile History, because it once again brought home to us something that is not often acknowledged in other histories of libraries and book collecting, and that is the paramount importance of private collections, of private collecting. And that's what all these auction catalogues were showing us, that while for example, the great university library of the Netherlands in the 17th century, University of Leiden, had about 4,000 books. There were many, many professors in the 17th century who had personal libraries of over 10,000 books. And this was a sort of culture of collecting that went far down the social strata as well. It wasn't only great professors who would be acquiring books, but also apothecaries or students, ministers of the church, who would all be building these fantastic private libraries that, you know, they've been totally lost to time. And that highlights the fragility of our story. Because really one of the key points of our book is the sad truth of library history, that no person is as interested in a collection of books than the first person who put those together. You know, if you think about the fact that if your parents own books, there's also a good chance that you acquire some books in your own lifetime as well. When your parents die, there's very few people who are willing or able to take in all that collection into their own home and simply add to it. It has to be dispersed in a way, because people want to, they grab onto things from the past that they enjoy or they like, but they cannot keep everything. So there is a natural cycle of dispersal and regeneration in library history that really hasn't been told before. And that's one of the key things we wanted to do with our book.
So let me actually stay on that for just a moment, because Andrew, you tweeted recently, and that's where we really know each other best, is besides your books in Twitter, that you got some magnificent new bookshelves. So paradoxically, while getting new bookshelves, you wanted to get rid of books. I don't quite understand that, but fine. And so you had some hundreds of books ready to give away and trying to find a home for them. So as that private collector and personal librarian that you are at the moment, a little weird side question. How are you coming to your own curatorial decisions about what you keep and why, and your worries about what happens to these bookish children as you let them go?
Well, it's a fair question, and it's a very difficult moment for a collector when they have to say enough's enough. In the course of sort of triaging my collection to see what I wanted to keep and what's to go, I discovered I had something like 5,500 books, and that they had strayed into the rooms of so many of my graduate students and patient colleagues that even my flexible conscience was beginning to be touched by this. So what I did, Jeff, was I retained what I think is the core of the collection as far as my future projects is concerned. I gave away a lot of books to graduate students, little sections which represent the core of their PhDs, and to obviously to colleagues. Then before that process, I got a little work party together and we examined the books which were going to be let go, and we gave any that the University of St Andrews Library didn't have to the library, which they graciously accepted. And that leaves me with a core collection of about 3,500 books, which should see me through the projects that I'm going to do next.
So now talk to the larger picture of the progression of libraries from private to public, and then to modern day bibliographical collections too. But one thing that struck me in studying book history through you is the simple idea that scholars no longer needed to travel to the books could travel to them. But also that one didn't need to copy them. All this labor went away by going to a collection of books that existed somewhere. So you still did travel in that sense. And then there came a moment, and I didn't realize this so much till reading your book together, The Library, how much it was a birth of private libraries, and that there was a dawn of public that came much later. So talk about that progression, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. I mean, one of the key sort of findings of our study really is just how difficult human society finds it to curate and maintain collections of public books, and here meaning truly open to a wide variety of people. Because from the dawn of library history, there have been libraries that have had some sort of pretense to being public collections. Indeed, in classical Rome, victorious generals or ambitious statesmen would often create a public library, which was really more a demonstration of their power and demonstration of their ambition, rather than an actual collection where lots of people would be reading books or indeed even borrowing them. Really, these were libraries that were meant for as places where people could gather, where they could discuss, surrounded by this weight of intellectual superiority that surrounds them. And if great Roman writers like Cicero might find entry into every library possible, very few other people could. So that's one of the key things. Really, the public library as we know it today, that's funded by government, that is truly open to all people who wish to come and read and look at books there, that's really only an invention of the 19th century. And I think maybe Andrew wants to jump in here to tell a little bit more why exactly it took that long.
Well, I think you could say that the first 4 centuries after the invention of printing, 1450 to 1850, is a story of the failure to establish the public library. Great men, statesmen, often opened their collection to visitors, but normally only favoured scholars, as Arthur has described in the Roman Empire. People gave their books to the local community or the local church, but they tended not to be the sort of books that ordinary citizens wanted to read. So public libraries and these church libraries tended to be collections of theology, which were perhaps intermittently useful for people who wanted to, for ministers from surrounding villages. But apart from that, they were just a burden for the community. The other failure was the failure of university libraries. Most university libraries didn't let their students in, which is an extraordinary thought, which may give some of our listeners pause, because they were mostly assembled by donation. Apart from the Bodleian Library, virtually no library had an acquisitions budget, until the 19th century. So they were dependent on donations, and they were dependent on a librarian who was usually someone who wanted to be a professor, and so spent their time sulking and refusing to go and open up the library. If you wanted to be a librarian, you went and curated the collection of a prince, because that was much more interesting. You got to buy things on their behalf, and they were better collections anyway. So it really was the 19th century before we have this idea of the public library making any sort of progress at all. And even then, it was not necessarily destined to succeed, because by that time, citizens had begun to collect libraries of their own together, subscription libraries where a band of chums gets together and decides what they want to read, or the circulating libraries, often attached to bookshops, which allowed books to be rented out for small sums, either for a annual subscription or just on a book-by-book basis. And those were big challenges to the library movement. So to some extent, Jeff, I think we tried to write this book as a sort of antidote to conventional histories of the library, which always seem to stress beautiful buildings, the 10 most beautiful libraries in the world, or they tested the past against this model of the current public library and anxieties for its future, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. But indeed, these were very untypical of the library story, and that's something we wanted to point out.
You talk about that in the book, Andrew, of the atmosphere of the library. You know, the earliest printing shops, the Aldine printing shop was an academy. The library was a place where people argued and could be loud. And we reached this point where we treated both the library and the book as a holy object, I think, to some extent, to its own detriment. I wrote a book called What Would Google Do? And at the end of it, I said that I thought the book should be updated. In my latest book, I'm now recanting that. I say, let the book be the book. But I do think by making it so holy and untouchable, we took away so much of the life of it. When did the library become? When did that myth of the library as this temple kind of take over from the human library with life in it?
I think probably it took over pretty much in the 15th century, when collecting moved back out of the monasteries, which for a century had been the repository of Western civilization's learning, and it moved into the Italian cities, where upwardly mobile merchants and the sort of civic aristocracy realized that collecting books was one more way they could show off not only their wealth, like having silver and tapestries and cannons, but also their culture. And this is where the libraries became this social space where a gentleman would show off his books to his friends and they would admire them. Of course, at this time they were all manuscript books, so they were equal. They were all very effortful. To gather a collection of 300 books in the 15th century meant that you were seriously wealthy. But the idea of the book, the library as a temple of learning hasn't gone away. Think of all those American crime series where they have rows of legal texts behind just about everyone in an office. I'm sure never consulted. And look at me with my marvelous book, with the survivors of my book collection lined up behind me. Because the great thing about this is that all your students always assume that you've read everything in your library. So this is a marker of my learning. And of course, I never disabuse them of that fact.
I am reminded, Andrew, by your story of going over the books of course, the scene in Don Quixote, where they're judging his library and seeing what should be saved and what was good and what was bad. Arthur, you wanted to join in on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's largely to think about Andrew's point of the library becoming a social space in these Italian cities in the Renaissance. But I think at the same time, a little bit later down the line, and this goes back to this issue of the failure of any public library, is that people who curate and establish these communal collections are often totally paranoid about access and safety. You know, this is an age, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, when there's lots of libraries and churches that still have chained books, where the books are physically chained with metal chains to either a bookcase or a reading desk of sort, for fear that people will run away with them. And we have other instances of university libraries where, when they were first established, there was this attempt to say this should be a social space. And if you look at engravings of the period that depict libraries, they often have this sort of grand space where there's lots of scholars milling about and they're having conversations, and there's, you know, someone on a ladder getting a book. You even see pets in the library. And all of this is an illusion, because whenever they tried to do this, the result of it was that very quickly they reduced the number of keys in circulation that would allow people into the library. Often there was only a single key in the hands of the librarian, and access for most university libraries until about the middle of the 19th century was restricted to about 4 hours a week, 2 hours on a Wednesday afternoon and 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. So there is this sense that people have this great ideal of the library being a space of scholarly collaboration, of an exchange of knowledge that's ever growing. But the reality is that very often it is indeed a temple, and in some cases, of course, a tomb of books.
I like that reference. You remind me that, as you may know, the New York Public Library just got rid of fines for its books, and within the weeks since, I think 80,000 books have been returned. So in a sense, unlocking made a big difference. Well, so let's go with that metaphor further. And you know, I think the story, as I see it, you know, the much of what your work is in book history, writ large, is about the creation of publics. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'm struck. I learned through Brand Luther the importance of Luther's decision to write in German, and write then for a public. Mm-hmm. And the library going from a very private, controlled, lockdown institution. When do you start to see the glow of an idea that learning should be public, that books for the public are a good thing, not a frightening thing for them to become learned? And of course, there's a fight over that. There's fear, as there is on the internet today, of the reading and speech of the public. But what did it take for books to be able to create publics?
Mm. Well, I think you've got an incremental process, if I may say so. In Luther's time, you already have in some cities about 50% male literacy. So you have a critical mass at that point, and that's what actually assists the Reformation to get going. And the sheer weight of the number of books that were being published in support of Luther and of Luther's works made people think that this is something big that's going on. You can't sort of argue against this great enormous wave of pamphlets. And then in the succeeding centuries, you get the closing of the literacy gap, which is a very important part of the story. That is that the gap between town and country closes, but even more specifically, the gap between male and female literacy closes. First of all, in places like the Dutch Republic, so we are able to cover it in our book on the Bookshop of the World, but then later in other parts of Europe. And people realize that women are not only an important market for books, but also important producers of books. Then in the 19th century, you get increasing anxiety about literacy and its impact. You get, particularly in the heavily industrialized societies like the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, you get people thinking you've got all these people in these new industrial cities, they can all read, we're giving them a vote, we want them to be educated in such a way as that they can enter the civil community and play a part in it. And this is a lot. This is a lot of the background to the public library movement is a conscious attempt to educate the new industrialized classes in their civic duties.
Yeah, and if I may add on to that, you really see a development in these early public libraries. So from about the middle of the 19th century onwards, of a sense that these librarians view themselves as professionals with a mission, and this is often a mission to give books to people. They choose the books based on what they think the people need rather than on what they want. And this helps explain why, certainly in Great Britain, the great Public Libraries Act of 1850 that allowed communities to introduce local rates to establish a library, why so few communities actually took that up. So there was the opportunity for true public libraries, but many of them didn't take it up. And I think this is partially explained by the fact that to many, especially working class citizens, libraries would have been pretty intimidating places. We think today as one of the beauties of libraries, of going to a library, as the ability to browse and borrow. You can go to stacks, you can have a good look, you stumble upon something you didn't know existed, you take it to the safety of your own home where you read it with your coffee or a glass of wine into the evening hours. Those two things were non-existent for most of the 19th and indeed even the early 20th century. You couldn't necessarily borrow books in public libraries, and you had to go to the librarian for recommendations or to ask and request specific titles. Now, this means that every act of your library engagement was heavily supervised. This also explains why so many people in the age of the public library continue to go to commercial alternatives, like the circulating libraries Andrew was mentioning earlier, where really it's a totally different model because you're going to a bookseller who's making money from you, which means that the bookseller really wants to give you what you want. So you will keep coming back and keep borrowing more books. And this continued to really trouble public libraries until the early 20th century.
Well, this goes back to something that you wrote about in the book, and you just alluded to, Andrew, about I'll escalate it to a moral panic about especially women and fiction, the fears around the corruption and the corruptibility around books. And I can't help, of course, but bring that to today, where the United States, in our latest wave of stupid, we have a considerable movement to ban a fair number of books from mouse. My latest was, I tweeted this yesterday, the author of a children's book about being a unicorn, that is to be being unique and special, was banned from giving a talk to students because somehow I guess it was seen as phallic or something. I don't understand what the problem was. But the advantage of the library is a centralization of the opportunity of knowledge. The disadvantage is also a centralization of attention and control. And so I guess just as I asked for a sequence looking at the publicness of the library, I'm also looking at the flip side of that, the sequence of control and censorship around libraries. What did you find in your research in the book?
Well, really, that this issue of control is ubiquitous. It's ever present. You don't, there's not a single age when these in the history of the library where these issues don't play. We even in obviously in totalitarian societies, there's always been a great attempt to censor and restrict certain types of books to people, but also really to use libraries as means to inculcate certain ideologies. In the 1930s Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were tremendous library builders. Certainly they're very famous for their great book burnings, which they did with great fervor. But they also tripled the number of public libraries in Germany, because there was this sense that if we provide these institutions and control carefully what books are in them, people will be entirely convinced of our perspective. And you really see similar attempts in 16th century Catholic Europe, in Spain and Italy, with the sort of cleansing of monastic libraries, of university libraries, even of private libraries. We know that in 17th century Mexico, whenever somebody died and their estate was being valued, there was a regulation that an officer from the Inquisition had to attend to see if there were any books in the private collection that were on an index of forbidden books, so they could then be taken out of circulation before all the books were sold. So, you know, in every state, there is this issue of control you speak of.
Yeah, I mean, yes, censorship is a very difficult word. It's one of these sort of
yes, especially now. I agree.
One of these sort of pantomime boo-hiss words that you all know you're against it, but on the other hand, we're all in favour of it at the same time. You have to remember that in the first 2 centuries of print, the most enthusiasm for censorship came from within the print industry itself. Now, this is important to remember because we think always of censorship as being imposed from the top down as a form of oppression. But of course, people who produce books, the last thing they wanted is if they'd invested heavily in the translation or the production costs for someone else to be producing the same book. So they sought what was called a privilege, that is a monopoly. And the manipulation of these privileges and licensing to print meant that the authorities didn't find print an adversarial source. I mean, this is the other problem with the sort of Eisenstein narrative of print leading to democracy, leading to the United States, which is basically her story, is that on the whole, printers weren't up for a fight with the local authorities or the crown. So you get 10 books celebrating victories of their rulers for every one sort of tiptoeing around the idea that a battlefield occasion hadn't gone very well. So we have views about how print should be based more on the 19th and 20th century history of the newspapers, where newspapers plucked up the courage to be adversarial. But up until then, that hadn't been the case. And even today, I think very few societies would be prepared to think that it was seemly to have absolutely unlimited access to information channels. I remember when we first had the internet, people were saying this would be the total democratization of knowledge because you'd have free access to it. Journalists should lose their jobs because we would have citizen journalism. Well, the citizen journalism very soon became the internet troll. So that didn't work all that well. And I think a totally unregulated information landscape is not something that people seem ultimately to want.
Yes, I mean, a very timely observation, given that as we speak, Elon Musk is threatening to buy Twitter because of its censorship, wanting free speech. I would say that speech has never been freer. And the problem is whenever a new mechanism allows more people to be heard than were heard before, then those incumbents who had controlled the conversation will resist and try to control it. And I'm reminded, you tell me, professors, if I'm getting this wrong, but what is often called the first call for censorship, Niccolo Perotti in 1470, complaining to the Pope about a translation of Pliny, and how the Pope must appoint some smart people to deal with this crap before it gets printed. And as I thought about that, I realized that it wasn't a call for censorship at all. It was a call for the creation of an institution that we now know as editing or publishing. And it was a call for quality control. It was a call for someone to look over this. And I think that we find ourselves there today where the institutions we then created, beginning, you tell me, a century and a half after movable type, we are inadequate to the scale and task today. I, for one, celebrate the voices that we can hear now that we couldn't hear before, especially in media run by people who look like me, old white men. We see a wonderful diversity of voices. But at the same time, people are going to manipulate that freedom. And the systems that were set up by the platforms were too optimistic and didn't know what to do. Yeah. And so then the problem is that all speech gets condemned. Mm-hmm. Oh, this internet is a terrible thing. Wasn't that true as well in the early days of print, where you had good speech and what was seen then as bad and uncontrolled speech? Witness the index.
Well, I think you're certainly onto something, Jeff, because even in the age of print, local authorities were far more concerned about what was said, particularly what was said in the pub, or what was sung, because that was so much, right? so much more easily remembered, and certainly what was preached. They kept very close control of that than they were of what was printed. In principle, all jurisdictions in Europe had pre-publication censorship of some sort or other, but it was impossible. You went to take your book to be censored and you'd find the bishop was out hunting. So mostly they relied on self-censorship because that worked. And if you occasionally imprisoned a printer for printing something you didn't like, that seemed to encourage the others not to go too far. But actually censorship of the printed word was so impossible because, remember, Germany had 300 different states then. So if you couldn't print it here, you could print it 10 miles away. So it was actually why the censorship of speech and song was so much more important to local councils than the censorship of print.
On the way to Arthur, let me just mention that for those of you who are listening and watching, if you'd like to leave questions or make arguments, please use the Q&A and they'll ship those to me. Arthur.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. No, just back on this point of quality control. I think you're absolutely right when you're discussing this sort of the first instances of censorship in the age of print is indeed often very much an issue of quality control, and this continues to come back, and indeed it's often the people in the industry itself who are involved in this. And really, if we're thinking about an intersection of this and the history of libraries, I can't think of a better example than of the great English bookseller Charles Edward Moody, who in the 19th century ran the largest circulating library in England. I mean, he had branches all over the nation. He had his sort of great book emporium in London, had almost 1 million titles in stock. So basically, if you were a publisher in England in this period, you had to get Moody to buy your books to include in the circulating library. If you didn't, it wouldn't sell. And Moody's, one of his real specialisms was fiction. And fiction, as we've already touched on a little bit, had always been this issue of danger in libraries. You know, we don't want to make too much fiction available to people because it might corrupt them. And Moody was really an upstanding defender of good fiction. So when publishers sent him texts of titles they wanted to publish, he might say, well, I'm happy to do it, but these passages really need to be altered because this is, this isn't right. There's too much drinking in this chapter. Why are people swearing? And all those sorts of issues. And I think for the most part, publishers complied, because if Moody rejected your book, there was no way you were going to make any profit with it. So this is institutionalized quality control that has a direct impact on what text is available to a reading public.
Yeah. Can I, Jeff, just add
Please.
one thing to that? And it's a wonderful story that when the market for romance became important in the 1930s, there were a lot of almost exclusively female authors who made quite a lot of money from this, but they had to go through quality control. And I remember one very successful author reminiscing that her heroine and the gentleman that she will eventually fall into love with share a glass of sherry and then another glass of sherry, and she sent the chapter up to the publisher and a telegram came back saying, "Lose the sherry."
Let's shift for a moment and talk about the library of today, which, as you said, we would get to. On the one hand, libraries are threatened by the kind of censorship calls, you should be censoring this, I mean. We see in the United States the furor over the 1619 Project and critical race theory and so on and so on. They're under pressure. They've always been under pressure, but they're under pressure of new flavors all the time. They're under financial pressure. There was a belief, I think, in some quarters that if the internet was going to make obsolete the book and the library, both of which I pray are not true. But on the other hand, I see librarians adapting to the new world of the internet better than my own field of journalism, better in many ways than education. They've recognized their role in communities in, I think, fairly inspiring ways, and are rethinking their roles around information and research as well as community service. So what's your thought? I guess I've got two questions here. We can do it one then the other. And I know it's what historians hate to be asked, but to find parallels with the past, no, that's illegitimate. And then to predict the future, that's even worse. But I'm going to ask you anyway, because I'm an obnoxious journalist. First, I'd like to hear your prognosis for the library of today and tomorrow, and then how we should view the internet in this process of creation and preservation.
Okay, well, I'll give it a go for the first one at least, Jeff. I think in making prognosis, I think we have to recognize that every sort of great media revolution always comes accompanied by a great deal of prophecy. And like you mentioned, lots of people have been saying that the book is the end of the book is nigh, the end of the library is nigh, and they've been saying that for most of the 20th century. We've had some critical inventions in that period. We've had radio, we've had television, we've had the terrors of microfiche and microfilm. We've had the CD-ROM. We have the internet. More books are published every year than have ever been published in any previous year, if you see what I mean. So we are still, in some ways, the physical book is despite all these things marching on. I think also that the library will too. It will have to adapt, I think, and I think that's certainly what you were hinting at. And I think actual librarians, people who work in libraries all the time, are doing this constantly. It is very true that we're seeing different types of evolutions depending on what libraries we're looking at. If we go back to our issue of private collecting that we highlight so often in our book, private collecting is doing better than ever. Somebody's buying all these books that are being published. There's more choice, there's more diversity, and certainly in the Western world, there's more sort of safety about accessing a great variety of literature than has ever been possible before. In university libraries, we're really seeing a switch, a rapid movement towards access of digital text among students. That is often a burden to university budgets, for example, because they have to buy expensive licenses from publishers of digital materials who are largely raking in this process. And then we have, for example, the public library system. Well, in the UK at least, the great public libraries in major towns are doing absolutely fantastic. They have often been renovated, expanded. They include more services than ever before. They have lots of space for people to work, and there's a still very good bookstock. What you're seeing in smaller branch libraries is an altogether different crisis, where really the audience is becoming older generally. And I mean, what Andrew and I did a lot of talking to librarians in the UK in preparation of writing this book. And, we found very hardworking, dedicated people who spent most of their days not worrying about books, but dealing with people with questions about accessing government services. So their work is much more geared towards a sort of almost, council service rather than librarian in the way that it's traditionally conceived. And I think that does worry me to some extent, because as soon as you take physical books out of a public library, you're not really left with much library, to be honest. So I think that will be a real strain for the future, to see whether extensive branch services can continue to survive. And the real challenge they face, I think, not just this issue of people turning more to the internet, but really the fact that as consumers of books, we expect the same sort of diversity in a public library system that we can now access either on the internet or in bookshops. And if that diversity isn't there and that stock isn't there for us to access, we turn away from them.
Yeah.
And that will be a big issue, but I know I'll let Andrew jump in here.
Yeah, well, where I'd start from is to say that we shouldn't assume that the problems of public library provision in our own neck of the woods are universal. I recognize what Jeff says about the United States. I certainly agree with what Arthur says about the UK, that this is not a crisis of the library, it's a crisis of the branch library network, that is the smaller branches with aging clientele. But when we did a radio show in Australia, we got bombarded by Brisbane phoners in who said that in Australia the public library service is in excellent shape and had a very, very good COVID. Raising the rules on how many books you might have, taking limits off, and really being the center of the community. Now, I don't think the public library in Britain is now the center of the community. But then if you go to the global south, these are often countries that are in the sort of post-colonial era of developing their library service. So they would regard the idea that the book is dead as crazy. I know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation devoted several billions to trying to bring internet access to populations all over the world, did a lot of very useful work. And I think they invested $2 billion in that. But then you think to yourself, what will happen in 20 years' time? Will we have a global internet cloud, so you will be able to access the internet wherever you are, as long as you've got some sort of device, or we'll be in a position where we no longer have cheap energy, and without electricity, where is the internet? So I would say, even looking 20 years ahead from this moment of crisis in energy provision is extremely difficult. And of course, that's a different situation in the United States because of the success of fracking and their lack of energy dependence on imported energy sources. But I'm extremely pleased, Jeff, to hear that you've recanted your view that the book is dead. I thought that was going to be the end of a brief but beautiful romance, had you not done so. Because, like Arthur, I see the book going on. And, you know, we have just in Britain conducted an extraordinary experiment with our young people. And that is, without asking their permission, we have told them that they will spend 2 years being educated entirely through a screen. There's very little data on what this does to concentration. There's very little neurological data on what is the impact of the physical book on reading. And what little there is suggests, as far as I've seen, that reading from a physical text as opposed to a screen is about 10% more efficient than screen reading. Certainly, as an old fogey, I can't read anything longer than 10 pages on a screen. I'll always print it out. And if this is the case, that we're actually harming both our young people's ability to remember what they're reading and their attention span, which I think is another victim of screen time, then we have to consider whether, for the convenience of having millions of pages available on screen, we're actually doing some substantial damage as well. But of course, the shame of it is that the nature of that damage will probably not be fully researched for another 30 years.
Well, in any case, I think I agree with you, Andrew. So that's I think that's certainly something to be said. And you know, the real danger here is as we know as historians, it's incredibly difficult for anyone to predict the future. Certainly with the rapidity of media change that we're seeing. So we're just going to have to see how that continues on. But I see Jeff is back here now.
I'm back. I don't know what happened. It's funny how that happens. It's all too prescient when the technology knows you're talking about it.
Yes. Yeah, well, as I was in the middle of saying, you know, we don't know if we'll have electricity in 20 years' time and reliable internet. You gave us a physical demonstration of precisely how problematic that is going
Pretty
to be.
smooth of me, huh? That is, I hadn't thought of that. That is a fascinating link. Pardon me for what I'm about to say, but when I was in Davos, sorry about that, about 15 years ago, I went to a session where Page and Brin of Google sat there awaiting the moment which we've reached, when renewable energy would be cheaper than coal, and that when that occurred, the explosion possible around the world, that because of the electricity, everyone would be connected, and you raise, you know, the uncomfortable linkage that exists there. Let me ask the second part of my question about the internet in the future, from the perspective of the internet as past. Mm-hmm. I love what you said when you spoke to the New York Public Library about how, and you made allusion to this in the short title catalog, you pay attention to the ugly ducklings, the things that are used to death, the things that are valued in present tense and not in presumed future tense. Mm-hmm. If you look at the internet today, you look at projects that do try to save things and all the things that are lost and gone. When I had the honor of talking to Elizabeth Eisenstein, you know, she bragged about how the floppy disks I had used were all useless, but Gutenberg's Bible had lasted 500 years. She was right. What kind of strategies, ethic, should we be looking at about preservation of our digital life today?
Well, that's certainly, when you talk to librarians in large institutions, that's a subject to which they're giving an enormous amount of attention. I think they were first signaled the importance of this when libraries started destroying their newspapers, having microfilmed them. And then there was a tremendous reaction to that, not least because people predicted correctly that the microfilm would soon be unreadable, as they often are now, or indeed there wouldn't be microfilm readers in libraries. I don't think we have a single public microfilm reader in the University of St Andrews Library. And so the other thing they were pointing out is that even a newspaper is not a sitting target. A newspaper may have 12 editions in the course of a single day as it's updated and extra news comes in. At what point, how many of those are you preserving? You know, what are you preserving? And then what are you going to be preserving of Twitter world? It's a really difficult problem, I think, for libraries if they see their role in the internet age to be as comprehensive as some of our major libraries have been able to be with the book world.
And if I may add to that, I mean, there's currently in the UK quite a lot of discussion about this, of the sort of the political implications too of the fact that so much what should be government information that should be archived and kept for the future is now being conducted on social media platforms and messaging services like WhatsApp. That once you take the 2 phone numbers away, there isn't anything left. So I think there's absolutely serious implications of that will continue to. I think it's going to be a continual challenge, to be honest. And we should also reflect here that, you know, in our world, certainly something I use almost every day is Google Books. Google's digitization of masses and masses of, in my case, what I'm most interested in is early printed books. You know, it's a great service, but libraries around the world, our great institutions, have all sort of signed up to this idea of basically having a great corporation hosting all of this. You know, there is absolutely no guarantee that this means it will be available for in a century's time, for example.
Yeah.
You know, what are we going to do then?
I think Google Books and all the other services which provide digital copies of early printed books are doing a fabulous service. But the idea that if you just go around all the great libraries, as Google Books seem to want to do, and you'll get everything from that, all you'll get is multiple copies of the same books, because their collections have, you know, all the standards, all the classics. The other thing is that this is now becoming an excuse for libraries to say there's a digital version of this book, therefore we will not show you the physical version. Now that is a retrograde step, because you learn so much more from a book with the book in hand than you can possibly do staring at it on the screen, however good the reproduction is. Not least the paper quality. You learn so much from a book just by feeling its pages.
Yes. Well, so I have on my desk right next to the screen where you're now resident, a Caesar scanner that costs about $100. And so when I would get out one of the high-priced Brill books from the New York Public Library, I can come home and scan it and print it out oddly and reprint it so I can mark it up and return the book and save a fortune, right? Those yellow books behind Arthur, all of you, are Brill books. They are brilliant. They're wonderful. They're a great academic resource, and they cost an arm and a leg because that's what academic publishing does. Let me shift now to you two gentlemen and the great buddy movie story of your working together. Andrew, you've been, and I've heard you say this before, but you've been, I think, terribly generous in having a collaborator in Arthur, but also in appreciating your partnership and what it's like. And it's hard for me to imagine this because when I shifted from writing for newspapers and magazines and I became a blogger, I became editorially feral. I love what I love about blogs is screw the editors. I can say whatever the hell I want. Yet now I'm writing a book called The Gutenberg Parenthesis, and it went out for review, and I only got one review back, and I'm a little scared now that I'm not getting enough editing. So I'm curious about both the value you each see in collaboration, but I'm really curious about the process. How you decide who should research what, who should write what. You've talked about how you edit each other. Why don't you start, Andrew?
Well, the only thing we ever argue about is who had the idea in the first place. But when we have the idea, there's a pub in St Andrews, where Aikman's, where we go with an envelope and we map out the chapters on the back of this envelope. Then we divide them between us. Then we each write the chapter, and we then give it to the other one. They mark it up in track changes, and then it goes back to the original author, and you accept all the changes without argument. And this is the crucial step. And then it's done. It's a very easy process. And I discovered actually in one of the public libraries, which was threatened with closure, where I was spending a couple of hours just to see who went in and out, I found Hugh Laurie's autobiography. And he told us that this is exactly the way that Richard Curtis and Ben Elton wrote Blackadder, that they gave each other their work and they accepted what the other guy said. But, you know, more seriously, I can't see why more people in the humanities don't do it. We're lucky we're in the same university, but have someone else as interested in the project on a day-to-day basis as you are is such a luxury. I'm very blessed that Arthur has an extremely precise and retentive mind. He is a very fine editor. But even after you finish the book, we discovered with the library book another great benefit, and that is, when you go off to talk at book festivals and the like, it's an adrenaline charged occasion, and it's very good when there's two of you, because one can think while the other's talking, and then afterwards you go off absolutely full of adrenaline, and so you've got someone else to triumph with afterwards and enjoy a steak, and it's one of the nice parts of the process.
Yeah. No, it's a real pleasure, the co-authorship, and I think Andrew is absolutely right. We have this sense that the creative writing process requires sort of solitary genius, and ultimately, when we've divided up our chapters, someone needs to, either I or Andrew does need to do some writing, but that doesn't mean that the process comes afterwards needs to be solitary. This process of exchanging drafts and just works extremely well. And it should also be said that we both do put in some research hours into the other guy's chapters. So it's not that I just say I'm given chapter 2, I do all the research at chapter 2 and write it. Andrew also has thoughts about chapter 2. And we discuss that all the time. So he says, oh, by the way, do make sure, you should mention this, or I found this interesting source that has a good citation for you. So we have a sort of shared Dropbox folder where we can constantly access each other's files and drop in notes and annotations. And that means that the process of building the actual argument that comes out of the book is very, very collaborative, even if I was the person who wrote it or it was Andrew. And I think that's important because it also means that when we come to then trying to publicize and sell the book, that if there's any criticism, that Andrew can't just say, well, that was Arthur's chapter, so I'm not responsible for that one.
I do say that if we get criticized in reviews, I have to say.
Yes.
You wrote that.
and then sadly for Andrew, sometimes he gets that process wrong, and actually it was him. But no, all joking aside, we both need to own what's in the book. And you can only do that if you truly share the process of thought that goes into it, and don't just treat it as an exercise in saying, this is your half and this is my half, and we happen to just publish it together. It's in one integrated whole.
So Arthur, stay on this for a moment. We'll act like Andrew isn't here for a moment. So as I said, I read all of these books. I treasured them. I used them. I have probably passed a legal limit about how many times I should quote one person in the manuscript I'm working on. The number of Pettegree footnotes is voluminous. And one of the tragedy, well, not the tragedy, the personal loss to me in the pandemic was that I didn't get to come to a US TC event that was going to be held and to meet, my God, to meet Andrew Pettegree, and a sharp event I was hoping to go to as well for just that reason, because I admire him so much. So I want to hear a little bit about what it's like to learn from him. I want to hear, and Andrew is obviously has a great self-deprecating sense of humor and can poke back, which I think helps lighten things. But he is the dean of book history, goddammit. And here you are working with him as a student first, and then as a collaborator. Just as personally as a teacher, I'd like to hear from your perspective as a student about that relationship.
No, absolutely. I can certainly talk to us. I mean, it's. I've always been in a very privileged position in the way my career has developed, and the luck that Andrew was my teacher and that he then took me on, and my sort of process of becoming a historian has been influenced immensely by that. So much so that my writing style is in many ways modeled on Andrew's, which means that we often run this game with our students in our modules to see whether they can guess who wrote which chapter. And no one's ever succeeded in winning that and getting it. So there's that process. But if I sort of think there's some key things that that Andrew has sort of instilled in me in that process, I would first of all say the importance of story and narrative. You know, that the historian's profession is not to just raise arguments about dead people, but really to tell human stories. And you know, that's something we always try to communicate in our writing, that if you're talking about the history of the library, it doesn't just need to be about buildings, it needs to be about human people inhabiting them and using them and destroying them. And then secondly, I would say a key thing is always about sources. You know, when you're a student, first starting out on your degree, there is this immense burden you feel of having to prove yourself, of having all these, you know, the books behind me that other people have written, and that somehow you should find a way into that. And I think much of scholarship exists about just constantly arguing with other people. And what Andrew really taught me is that it shouldn't be about, it can be about that, but only at the final end. It should always first be about sources. You should actually go to historical sources and investigate them and explain what they say before you come up with a grand idea. You let the sources do the history for you, and then comes your analysis, not the other way around. And I think those are probably the two most valuable sort of lessons that allowed me to develop my career. And I should say it's been a fun journey. Like you say, Jeff, you know, I first met Andrew when he was already a great professor, and I was just an undergraduate student. And I've accompanied him to a couple of conferences now, after I already knew Andrew for 5 or 6 years, so I knew everything about him. When people come up to him and say, "Oh my goodness, you're Andrew Pettegree," you know, "Can I bask in your glory?" Which is always very funny, to be honest. So I enjoy that process.
Andrew, as a teacher and a scholar, you clearly have a generosity of spirit in this kind of relationship, and I'm curious about that idea of that you see yourself as collaborating with a student in a sense. That's something I don't think I hear often in education.
Well,
At least lower levels.
to be honest, I think I've just got to that stage of my career when I can please myself about what I write, and I can explore new areas and new boundaries. But I've found a collaborator who enjoys that every bit as much, and I have to say brings a great deal to our projects, which I don't have. Art has a most tremendous memory, and I have to say, you'll be experiencing this too, I'm sure. There are times when, you know, the name of the author's name just somehow doesn't come into the front of your head at the moment you want it. And so yes, it's been a really interesting experience, but it has to be based on mutual trust. And you know, one of the things I really value about my career at the point it's got to now is as a university teacher, Jeff, you're spending a lot of time with young people who are inherently optimistic. And you are at an age where most of your contemporaries are not so optimistic. Yes. And it's like you know, taking a rejuvenating drug every day, coming to work to meet all these people. And one of the things I'm most proud of is launching people into their own careers. I think hopefully having some of the values of valuing collaboration and seeing academic work as a vocation where their duty is to pass on knowledge to younger people and assist them in their careers. And really that's the starting point for all of this.
I want to talk about what you're each doing next in a few minutes as we come toward a close. But I first want to hear your origin stories alongside the origin story of book history. When I read Eisenstein, coming to it fresh, right? I'm just an idiot journalist. You know, we write the first draft of history, all that hubris we have, so we don't pay attention to history. So when I read it, I was struck by the defensiveness of her tone.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't realize the reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
That there wasn't, in her view, a proper study of print and its role, not deterministically, but instead as a tool that was used in on all kinds of new ways. And then to read the fights about her and the schools of book history is fascinating to me from the outside. That this is, to me, surprisingly, a relatively new field.
Mm-hmm.
And, in your lifetimes, well within, even yours, I think, Arthur. No, perhaps not, but close. So, yeah, actually not, but I'll give it to you. So I'm curious how each of you got into book history and your thoughts about the state of it.
Yeah. Well, book history is in tremendous shape. It's become mainstream. It's engaging many, many more people. And one of the things I really like about it, and particularly the collective volumes we publish in the Library of the Written Word, is that a lot of the time we're publishing people for the first time in the English language. And this means a lot to scholars from Eastern and Central Europe and Scandinavia that we can do this for them. I suppose the two formative influences in my life is, one, I'm a country boy. So when I started working on the Reformation, when people said, gosh, it took a long time for Protestantism to take root, you think, well, try coming and living in rural Shropshire in the 1960s. It takes 30 years to be accepted that you're not an outsider. And then the other thing was the fall of the Berlin Wall, because I was an adult already in the 1980s, and those of us on the left were very much for sort of accepting the East German school of Reformation history as valuable, accepting that it was within a Marxist context. And then 1989 came along, East Germany was integrated into the German nation. All these guys got fired, they lost their jobs, and none of us lifted a finger. We just accepted that was then. So that's the point I gave up theory. And I've really never been interested in arguing with fellow scholars. One of the great things about publishing trade books is that you really are talking about the past, so you don't really mention any other practitioner in your work. And book history I came to as a natural extension of my work on the social history of religion, because the books were so important to the Reformation. I just wanted to test whether the importance of the books of the Reformation was replicated elsewhere. And so I did some work on France, and I suppose I'm just a natural stamp collector. And instead of having to collect rare books, I've collected them virtually. And that's what the USDC is. It's my virtual stamp collection.
Yeah.
Arthur, when you came as a nipper to university, what did you think you were going to study and be? And I'm going to guess it probably wasn't book history. And then how did you come to adopt it?
Well, I would say I probably thought I'd be a historian of the Crusades, to be honest. I mean, that just that was just so exciting. No, I mean, I tried to do all sorts of history at university, but one of the things that really stuck with me was the 17th century, and I was particularly interested, given my Dutch background, in the great Anglo-Dutch wars. So that's something that always fascinated me. But really, it was having a chance to come to St Andrews that I got the opportunity to do some work on the history of news. And I did this work on the sort of first Dutch newspapers that were published in the 17th century, and that's really what got me into book history, Jeff. And it's funny you say that, you as a journalist, sort of first draft of history means you don't write history. But I would say the opposite. I was fascinated. I became really interested in book history because I saw it as a means to see what people were thinking and saying at the time that history was being made, rather than us just as historians now looking back and saying, well, the 17th century was the time of so-and-so, actually looking at what are the texts that are being created by people, what do they say? And that was really my entryway into it. And then Andrew says he's a stamp collector through the USCC. I also happen to actually collect 17th century books. So when I first realized you can actually buy these things at book markets or online, and then hold them in your hands and keep them on your shelves, it's not often that you have things in your home that are 400 or 500 years old, and having a row of 400 or 500-year-old books in your home, that's pretty special. So I enjoy that aspect of it too.
One more allied question to you, Andrew. This is personal curiosity, but as I delve into the intramural scuffles in book history, and by the way, book history, of course, itself is a limiting term because it is newspapers, it is ephemera, it is all this as well, but history of print, and the French versus Anglo-Saxon schools, those who analyze the kind of cultural impact and those who analyze the objects and the materiality. Do you place yourself on any scale in the existing fraternities and sororities of book historians?
Well, if I were to say that I wasn't aware there were French and Anglo-Saxon schools, I think that's a partial answer. Yes. I had the great privilege, actually, of being the book history discipline representative for the Renaissance Society of America for six years. And that really introduced me to a very interesting strand of work that scholars of English literature do on book history, which came at it from a totally different angle from historians. And I've tried always, when we're recruiting either postgraduate students or postdocs to our group, to bring in people from different disciplines than history, because they have, I would say, sensibilities that we don't have. Sensibilities to text. People who work on French literature or German literature are particularly useful. And it's sort of it's a naturally international subject because the book world was so international itself. So I'm not really a schools of sort of guy.
Good. So finally, I'd like to hear what you're going to work on next, each of you.
Well, I can go first. Yeah, I'm currently finishing up a book, Jeff, that's basically coming out of my PhD thesis, which is now almost 4 years ago already. But it's a study of political communication. And I'm particularly interested and this book basically investigates how government in the 17th and 18th century, how it communicates with its citizens and its people. And what happens when governments demand ever more taxation and issue ever more laws? And how do they get people how do they persuade people that these are a good thing? And so this is a sort of study of an intersection of printed media, because governments are using lots of printed placards and pamphlets to disseminate their law. But it also very much intersection of just general history of communication, because it relies to a very large extent on oral communication through proclamations, through word of mouth. So that's really my next book to come out, so probably sometime next year.
Can I just say that, having had the pleasure of watching and reading the chapters of this book as they come out, it is a fantastic piece of work. It's going to be published by the British Academy, and I think it's going to be field shifting. So very much looking forward to that. Meanwhile, I've been whiling away the time writing a book on books in wartime and the role that books play in incubating the ideologies that lead to war, books and training in military colleges. But then, who reads books in wartime? What happens to authors in wartime? Where are books most effective? And is it legitimate, therefore, with books being really mobilized as munitions of war, is it legitimate that libraries are then targets? These are issues that I follow, and that's going to be published probably in 2023, again by Profile, and I'm delivering it later this year. Then we're hoping to get the band back together again to write a history of communication. That is the whole communication process, moving beyond books to obviously radio, television, the internet, but also reaching back into singing, reading, talking, admiring architecture, listening to music, smiling or grimacing. What is communication before language? So we want to do an integrated history of communication and take this out of the sort of specialist academic silos where these sort of works separate us, so that the musicians have their musicologists and then manuscripts have medievalists, whereas we want to do the whole history of communication from the singing Neanderthal to TikTok in one book, and hopefully in 120,000 words if we can keep it that.
So wish us luck, Jeff.
I do, considering, well, first, I can't wait for all three. I might as well plug mine. I just signed the contract yesterday, so I will have a book called The Gutenberg Parenthesis coming out in 2023 as well. And I'm now in the process of cutting it from 170,000 words to 130,000 words. So,
ouch.
Yeah, well,
that is.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to contemplate one thing before we leave, since we're on video. I have in my hand, if you can see it here, just a piece of type.
Mm-hmm.
And everything that these gentlemen have studied comes from the study of how this one little thing was placed one after another in a composing stick, and made into words and lines and paragraphs and pages and books and newspapers, and then taken out and cleaned and put back in the boxes, so it can be done again. And the process of that technology and how it provided a tool for the world is amazing. And these two gentlemen have done great work, and you should be very proud as a university to have them on this field and on the impact of it and understanding it. And thus, even though I'll perform this historical heresy here, I think it all reflects and gives us lessons for how we go through the next change today. And so all of these books are immensely timely in understanding where they go. So I can't wait for the next three. I wonder how many McLuhan references you will or will not have in the history of communication. And I want to thank you both for this opportunity. It's for me an honor and an opportunity to talk to you, because I admire your work so much. I want to thank the University of St. Andrews for making this event possible, and you, the alumni of the university, and its supporters for helping make this kind of scholarly work possible. So someday soon we will meet in person, and I can't wait for that day. But in the meantime, thank you for having me here, and thank you very much for the work you do and for this conversation.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Real pleasure speaking today.